Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. Particular thanks too for the people who've lent me DVDs to help me put this podcast together. Here's one of those kind folks now.
I want them back! They're my property!
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
The story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Film Stories.
We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always that's everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast though, well, as the title suggests, I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, release stories, marketing stories, all the ingredients really that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of the movies and a real appreciation that somehow, through some miracle, through all the difficulties, films manage to get made. Without further ado, I'm just going to jump into the first of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. As always, I'm going to set it up with a clip from the trailer. I will come to the story, the other side of this.
Go!
As the world fell, each of us in our own way was broken. It was hard to know who was more crazy. Me or everyone else.
And that was part of the trailer for 2015's Mad Max Fury Road, directed by George Miller, script by George Miller, Brendan McCarthy and Nico Lathoris, and starring Tom Hardy, Charlize Theron, Nicholas Hoult, Rosie Huntington-Whiteley, Riley Keough, Zoe Kravitz and Abby Lee. So let's take this story 30 years before the release of the movie we're talking about, to 1985's third Mad Max movie, Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. Now, this was after the sensational opening pair of Mad Max features from director George Miller. This was a slightly tamer affair, in fact predating what would happen throughout much of the 2000s. This was one that was brought in at a PG-13 rating in the US, a slightly broader seeking film, if you like, trying to get a more family audience into a Mad Max picture. Tina Turner co-starred with Mel Gibson in the film, but I mean, it was a tamer affair in more than one sense. And the legendary Barry Norman here in the UK described it as not so much Mad Max as slightly cheesed off Max, which isn't a million miles far off the mark. The film itself didn't really measure up to the first two. It's earned a bit more respect since, and there's a title song to it which continues to resonate, but that looked like it was going to be it as far as George Miller was concerned and the Mad Max saga. He did move on to other projects. He didn't have the best of times on his next film, The Witches of Eastwick. He would move on to the Oscar-nominated Lorenzo's Oil. That was up for Best Picture in the early 90s. And then he would go on to The Babe and the Happy Feet films. I'm going to talk about a Babe film in the second half of this podcast. There was still a discussion in the 1990s about reviving Mad Max, though. And in 1995, there was talk of a television version of the the character, and George Miller was going to be involved. In fact, it got as far as Warner Brothers announcing it in November of 1995 that Miller was going to direct some of the episodes, but it's one of those projects that just quietly faded away. Yet, if we move to the early 2000s, that's when there was more open talk about a full-on fourth Mad Max movie, and now George Miller was interested. He'd admitted before that he was reluctant to return to the series, but from about 1997, it had been a bit more in his head that Miller had a moment that led to the film. And he talked about this in a discussion with the Playlist, where he said, "I remembered the moment when I was walking across a street, a crossing, and he said, while I was in the middle of the road, I got this sudden flash of a story. By the time I got across the street, I realised, oh my God, that's a Mad Max movie. It was the core idea." Now, that didn't mean he was instantly looking to make it. He was involved in the second Babe film at this point. But it was one of those things that just stuck in his head. He'd been reluctant to go back. And he did say at the time, the last thing I ever wanted to do was a Mad Max movie, so I pushed it away. But then we move forward to 2001 and a long flight that Miller was taking from Hollywood back to Sydney, and he found himself running through a version of what a new Mad Max film could be. And what he began to appreciate was, at some point there is going to be another Mad Max film, and it's one of those moments where it's just like, well, if I don't do it, someone else might do it instead. And on that flight, a nice long haul flight, he worked out what this film was going to be. And so it got to a point where he was talking to studios, and yeah, this was going to happen. In fact, come 2003, it looked like things were really moving forward. 20th Century Fox was the studio that was going to back a new Mad Max movie. Warner Brothers had backed the first three, and Heath Ledger was going to star opposite Mel Gibson. There had been early talk at that stage of casting Charlize Theron in a role, but at this point her agent wasn't interested. Theron would mention during the press tour for Fury Road, telling the New York Times, "No one ever told me about it." But events outside of the world of Mad Max stalled the movie because vehicles were already being built from the early 2000s for Mad Max 4, and the production was pushing for a March 2003 start. But a couple of major world events, one was the tragedy of and atrocities of 9/11, and the other was also the huge loss of life in the Iraq War, and these were all things that were concentrated in the early 2000s, and basically the political landscape felt wrong for a Mad Max film. But also there were practical knock-ons as well, because with the Iraq conflict underway, well, the shoot had been planned for the Namibian desert. And the cost of insurance, just off the back of the aftermath of 9/11, had rocketed. And also the sensitivities just felt a little bit wrong. They did get quite a way down the road. Colin Gibson, the production designer on the film, was in the Namibian desert when he got a phone call saying, "Do not spend any more money. The plug has been pulled. This is not going to happen now," in spite of the fact that quite a lot of resource had already been committed towards the project. And so Miller he saw how it was panning out, dusted himself down and headed off towards the first of the Happy Feet films, as it looked as though Mad Max 4 was pretty much dead in the water. Yet Happy Feet would prove to be an inspired choice for George Miller. The 2006 animated film was sold brilliantly off the back of tap dancing penguins and less off, let's just say, the darker elements of that story. It was a huge box office success for Warner Brothers. It attracted Oscar attention as well. And now Miller had currency again, that he could go to the offices of Warner Brothers, who were very keen for a Happy Feet 2. And it's like, well, if you want a Happy Feet 2, how about we do this as well? And by the end of 2006, Warner Brothers was interested in a Mad Max 4, and Miller was once again back in the Mad Max business and could start rebuilding his film. Now, it was going to be slightly different, that there was a change of cast for a start, that Mel Gibson's star, let's just say, had fallen and was falling, but also the passage of time meant that the central character of Max, well, still needed to be younger than Gibson, really. And so the version of Mad Max 4 that was officially announced in 2009 was quite a retooled version of what we were going to get originally in 2003. because, I mean, Gibson had burnt his bridges. There's no way around that. You can look that up everywhere on the internet. And I won't go into it here, but I do want to acknowledge he had burnt his bridges. He was not going to return. But who would? Well, one person who was involved in reading, certainly reading with some of the actors who were cast in the film, was Jeremy Renner. He was one of the leading candidates to take on the role of Max, the rebooted Max, if you like. And also Eminem was said to have been considered, but he was reluctant to leave the country to shoot the film. And so it was Tom Hardy who ultimately bobbled to the top of George Miller's list, and he was confirmed as on board in June 2010. Hardy was going to be the new Max. The film wouldn't make anything of it, would just carry on with the character there, and that seemed to be pretty much that. And what that also meant was that auditions were getting underway in Australia to cast the other supporting roles in the film. Meanwhile, while that was going on, it is worth noting that George Miller for a while was toying with the idea of, well, if we've got all of this construction going on, all of these vehicles, let's make 2 films at the same time. Let's do 2 back to back. That he'd worked out a story for a Furiosa film that would have served as a prequel to Mad Max Fury Road. And so for a while that was looking like it had some degree of legs. The idea was eventually parked. Charlize Theron would come on in the role of Furiosa. Her agent would pass the details on this time. And then the auditions going underway in Australia were casting the key supporting roles. And Zoe Kravitz told Carl Buchanan in his excellent oral history book of when they cast her, she said, I was brought to a room that I wasn't allowed to leave, and I sat there and read the script. And she said it was one of the strangest scripts I'd ever seen, because it was like a really long comic book. And she wasn't the only one who was struggling with it. That director of photography John Seale had come out of retirement to make the film, and anyone who was looking for a traditional script that Miller and his team had put together just simply wasn't going to get it. This was not a film bursting with dialogue anyway, but what Miller had plotted out was a whole bunch of storybook sequences that, if you're approaching a film in a traditional sense, might have been quite difficult to wrap your head around. John Seale was one of the many who just kind of figured, well, I don't quite get this, but I mean, we're in 2010 at this point. There's been a decade of pre-production work already, and he trusted the fact that George Miller knew the film at heart that he wanted to make. So it got to a point where filming was 2 weeks away from starting in 2010. This time it wasn't going to Namibia for the shoot, it was going to the Australian desert, much close to home for George Miller, and an area where the lack of rain had been a real boon. It had dried the ground out, a beautiful desert environment that had been scouted. All the vehicles were built, dozens and dozens of vehicles done practically for the film. The stunt team had been training intensely for some time. The actors had been put through their paces. The pre-production was really underway to a very, very advanced point. And then out of nowhere came what was described as a once-in-a-century level of rainfall. Just out of the sky, water and no shortage of it, on an area of land where they just hadn't seen it to anywhere like that degree for generations. And this was 2 weeks before filming was due to start on Mad Max Fury Road. But that was just the start of the problem. Because if it had just been the rain, well, they could wait for the rain to dry out and that would be fine. Then they could carry on. But what the rain meant was, well, it basically enriched the land. And so the desert landscape was now transformed into a vista of greenery. And so now you've got all these vehicles designed to drive across this desert that was at the heart of what was needed for the film. But it's like driving through a very, very pleasant set of gardens. I mean, it was just green as far as the eye could see. And the production just had to be mothballed. This was an absolutely critical point for the fourth Mad Max film. They had a really kind of binary choice here. Do you wait it out and just hope that it clears up and then go for it, or do you just abandon the whole thing? And they did decide to mothball. That they decided, well, let's pack everything up and wait a year and see if the landscape comes back to normal. And in the end, it just wasn't happening. And so Miller then took a further drastic option, that even though everything was already in Australia and ready to shoot, they were going back to the Namibia option. They were going to cart everything everything over to the desert in Namibia. Huge trucks, huge vehicles. All the cast and crew had to go over. The stunt performers had to go over, and the whole thing had to be set up again on a completely different continent. And as Miller told Collider at the time, he just said, we were all geared up for Fury Road to shoot in the Australian desert. Then those unprecedented rains came, and what was the wasteland? Completely flat red earth is now a flower garden, and the big massive salt flats where they do world record speed trials is full of pelicans and fish. Where the fish came from, I had no idea. And so he was saying at the time, theoretically next week we have 100, the shoot is next year, we have 150 big vehicles built, but to be perfectly honest, he said, I just finished on Happy Feet. I'm not even there in my head right now, because he had been working on the second Happy Feet movie, so it's not like he wasn't busy. But still, when a film disappears, I mean, I covered Greatest Days on this podcast a couple of weeks ago, and at the point where that had to shut down and then remount a year or so down the line, members of the cast had other commitments that they had to fulfill, and so they had to drop out of the film. Remarkably, in the case of Mad Max Fury Road, the casting held. You still got Charlize Theron, you still got Nicholas Hoult, you still got Tom Hardy, you still got the ensemble cast that was around, including people like Rosie Huntington-Whiteley and Zoe Kravitz. And in other films, some of those roles may have been recast, but there was something really just gluing everything together here. Now, Miller had been working on the script with a number of collaborators, but he was also very aware that he was asking some of the performers to take on roles. Their characters were sex slaves that the character of Furiosa was trying to save. And he wanted these characters to be properly fleshed out. He wanted them to not be ciphers. He wanted them to have presence in the film and agency in the film. And so he brought in some help. He brought in a playwright by the name of Eve Ensler. And Eve Ensler had penned the Vagina monologues, and she worked not just to help with the script, but also with the actors who were taking on those roles, just to make sure that there was real depth to what was being put on screen, that this wasn't just some lazy writing, there was something of real substance there. Theron, meanwhile, she was continuing to explore the character of Furiosa, and Furiosa was originally going to be long-haired, and the practicalities of that niggled with Theron. It's just like, if you're working with all this machinery, would you have that? And so she asked for her character to be a little more androgynous, for her head to be shaved, and when that look was revealed on the set of the film, I mean, it made headlines around the world. I mean, that's where really the attention of Mad Max was at that point. But in July 2012, in Namibia, filming finally got underway, and to say it would not be an easy shoot is no understatement whatsoever. As Colin Gibson told the New York Times, all the action had to be real. The hair can't stand up on the back of your neck, not for me anyway, watching Vin Diesel drag a 3-ton safe down through perfect right angle turns on the street. That is Colin Gibson throwing shade at Fast Five, chums. The whole rationale, he said, was to make it as real as possible, so that as much as possible was at stake. It was also being shot pretty much chronologically, which would provide just a little bit of help when it came to the edit. I'm coming to that shortly. But again, going back to Carl Buchanan's book, which started as an article in the New York Times, and then he had so much material, he expanded it out into a full oral history book. It's a tremendous read. He talks of how stunt performers would chat about, ordinarily on a blockbuster film, you would be preparing for one major stunt a week, something around that level, and you'd do all the preparation for it, you would shoot it, if needs be, you would go back to it. In the case of Mad Max Fury Road, they were having to do one a day. I remember after the film was released, one of the stunt performers just put a video they'd shot on Twitter or whatever it's called now, and it just showed that their entire viewpoint was just this massive ball of flame. The stunt performers were absolutely in the midst of this, and just the post, just that one single perspective, I found absolutely jaw-dropping. There was no green screen here, that while there was effects work that was done in post-production, what you see action-wise in the film is what was shot. They wanted that level of excitement. They wanted it to work. But this was also putting an immense strain on the people at the heart of it. It's pretty well known that Tom Hardy was on the prickly side, for instance, on the set of Mad Max Fury Road, and that he and Charlize Theron were not really getting along, that they've got on better since, but it was not the most fun shoot. And understandable to a degree. There were long days when people were just was crammed in a vehicle, and there wasn't much in the surrounding area where you could go and let your hair down after shooting had completed. Well, Charlize Theron would have struggled to get her hair down at that point, obviously. Few people here were in their comfort zone. Even people who'd done action films before had seen nothing like what George Miller was trying to do. Furthermore, even though us as viewers see it in a desert that looks absolutely scorching, the reality of it was freezing cold, and some of the filming was being done at night as well. So while all the crew could wrap up, the cast couldn't. And as Zoe Kravitz said, it had been 9 months, and 9 months, not 9 months where you're in a city and you hang out in your trailer. It was 9 months of the environment you're seeing in the movie with nothing around. And she said you really do start to lose your mind a little. Now, as Hardy would reflect at the press conference of the film, he did say, in hindsight, I was in over my head in many ways. And he talked about the tension between him and Charlize Theron behind the scenes. The pressure on both of us was overwhelming at times, he admitted. And what she needed was a better, perhaps more experienced partner in me. And he said, that's something that can't be faked. I like to think that now that I'm older and uglier, I could rise to that occasion. And come the release of the film, Hardy would indeed apologise for how things had gone. I mean, it was said too that he was incredibly tough on George Miller during the shoot. But then also, this was the kind of film where, because there wasn't a script, because there was not an obvious roadmap that people could kind of lock into, no one quite fully got the film that George Miller was trying to make. No one could really see it in the way that Miller could, which put overwhelming amounts of pressure on Miller himself. And also, I mean, shooting in Namibia, whilst on the one hand meant the film was far away from the reaches of Hollywood studios, that didn't mean that Miller wasn't having to deal with pressure from Warner Brothers, because Warner Brothers was worried. The film was pushing its budget and was pushing its schedule as well. And it got to the point where this very complex practical movie was running 5 days over schedule. Warner Brothers was investing 9 figures in the movie. And so the then head of Warner Brothers, Jeff Robenob, flew to the set in October 2012 to try and keep it on schedule. As was described, the president, as Jack Seal said it this way, the president of Warner Brothers flew to Namibia and had a gold-plated fit. That, again, it was hard to get a tangible fix on what this was. From the point of view of the president of Warner Brothers, it was running late. It wasn't hitting schedule. And he was insistent this had to wrap up. This had to be done filming by the end of the year. Now, there was a problem with that because the schedule was such they hadn't shot the start and the end, which I'll come to shortly. But Warner Brothers sent an experienced producer, Denise Denovi, to the set to keep an eye on the film. She wouldn't take credit in the picture in the end, but also there wasn't an awful lot she could actually influence. It had been planned to wrap up in November 2012. It wasn't really looking like it could, and when Mad Max Fury Road did finish shooting in Namibia in December 2012, the start and the end of the movie hadn't been filmed, but Warner Brothers denied the request to spend a few more weeks just getting those elements on film. What this meant was Miller went into the editing room knowing that he didn't have a start and an end to the picture. This was going to be a problem. He'd got to the end of a very, very taxing physical shoot, having basically had 7 shades kicked out of him, having lost weight, and then having to wrestle something together without, bluntly, all the tools required to do so. It was Margaret Sixel, Miller's editor, and also his wife, who had the job of fashioning the footage into something that worked. She'd never done an action film of this ilk before. This was all new to her too. And first thing she had to do was just watch the stuff. As she revealed to Far Out magazine, this was not an easy film to cut. She said that the overall orchestration was more challenging than anyone seen. Some of it looks deceptively simple, but the variables were enormous. Every sequence had a huge number of hours put into it, and every scene had to earn its place. No fat, no repetition. She was working 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, and it took 6,000 hours to edit the film. But perhaps that's not a surprise, because it took 3 months just to watch the footage. Depending which source you believe, I'll go with the Sydney Morning Herald. There were 480 hours of material. And I do this comparison quite a lot. If you go to the James Bond film that came out around the same time, Spectre, in the case of Spectre, they had 3 months to edit that film from the point that production finished, that the last shot was called. 3 months later, the film was in cinemas. Margaret Sixel had 3 months just to watch what had been shot. Never mind edit it, never mind knock it into any kind of shape. Just to physically watch the material took as long as it took to edit, to complete the post-production at least on Spectre. The extensive edit also required around 1,000 visual effects shots to be worked in as well. And in the background, there was studio politics playing out as well. Because one of the reasons that Jeff Robinov had been so tough on the film was he was fighting to save his job as the president of Warner Brothers Movie Side. And in the midst of it all, he lost his job. And in came his successor, a man called Kevin Tsujihara. And he was more sympathetic for the film because a new head of the studio comes in and thus takes a look at what's in the locker, what's on the slate. And so he took a look at how Mad Max Fury Road was shaping up, and he realised then that if they were going to go for this, they had to properly back it. They had to put the release back, they had to go for the reshoots. The film needed a start and an end, otherwise it's just an illogical waste of money. The logistics of reshoots were incredible because once again, those all those vehicles had to be back in Namibia. They had to be back in the desert. The actors had to be back there as well. The stunt performers, some of them on poles, remember, they had to be back there as well. And it wasn't until the end of 2013 that they managed to reassemble everyone and everything. And Warner Brothers authorised 1 month of extra shooting to get the top and the tail of the picture in place. Against this, the studio, whilst it was sympathetic on the one hand, it wanted a really lean running time on the other. I mean, the first two Mad Max films in particular are incredibly lean if you consider their running times. Warner Brothers was looking for a PG-13 rated movie that would run comfortably under 2 hours, and, well, it wasn't really getting it. Because Margaret Sixel would reflect that she didn't feel that Warner Brothers fully believed in it, but decided, well, I'm going to work through it anyway because I believe in it. I see what we're trying to do, and she's just going to carry on basically until someone tells her to stop. And so she delivered in the end, on behalf of George Miller, 2 different cuts of the film. One was the contractually mandated PG-13 version of Mad Max Fury Road. The other was an R-rated cut, and Warner Brothers, to its credit, agreed to test screen both of them. I should note that in the midst of all this, Junkie XL was contributing one of the very best action movie scores of the 2010s. But of the 2 different cuts of the film that were tested, to the delight really of George Miller and his team, it was the R-rated movie that was coming out the best. That was the one that was really scoring the highest. This was a cut that ran to 2 hours pretty much on the dot. But Warner Brothers had invested, 150 million, possibly a bit more to get to that point. It had got production partners with the likes of Village Roadshow Pictures and Rat Pack Gene Entertainment as well. So it hadn't put every bit of the funding in itself, but it put a sizable amount in, and it had a lot at stake here. And so it decided, right, we're going to do the gamble. And the final cut of the film, once those involved saw it, it was a jaw-dropping moment for many of them, because when they were in the midst of it, they had no idea this is how it was going to come out. I will put my cards on the table here. I think Mad Max Fury Road is an absolute masterpiece and the best action film to come out of a Hollywood studio in a very, very, very long time. Extraordinary levels of action that it's quite telling that even the actors in the midst of it all couldn't quite wrap their head around it. Such was the intensity of it all. On the 7th of May 2015, the film premiered, and then it quickly went to the Cannes Film Festival straight afterwards as well. I had a friend who was working on the promotion of Mad Max Fury Road at the time, and they told me, just ahead really, this is incredible. And they're not someone who was particularly known for hyperbole, but there was talk really ahead of the film's release that from the people who'd seen it, that this was something incredibly special, and it doesn't happen that often. I think it happened with Top Gun Maverick as well in recent times, but this was a blockbuster that was really quite different. The reviews for it were absolutely ecstatic, and reflective really of what the actors had found, that they'd not seen anything quite like this. Certainly, even if you'd watched the previous Mad Max films, and I'm a huge fan of 2 of them, the scale of what was being put on screen was an enormous step up, and the fact that it hung together and worked and had layers to it as well just felt like an achievement and a half in the midst of a Hollywood blockbuster environment in 2015, remember, where it's franchises, it's superheroes. That's the kind of stuff that was selling. And here was an R-rated action movie, a follow-up to a film that the last one had come out 30 years before, and here we were with something really quite special. Now, what that didn't necessarily mean was it would transfer to box office, but in this case, the film, whilst it didn't go absolutely catastrophically nuts, it certainly performed very, very, very strongly. Its opening weekend in the US, May the 15th to the 17th, it opened in second place, $45.4 million opening weekend, held off the top spot by Pitch Perfect 2, which came in at just shy of $70 million. Also in the top 10 at this point, Avengers Age of Ultron. This is the kind of thing it was up against. The comedy Hot Pursuit hadn't really done a lot for Warner Brothers. That was in 4th. Fast and Furious 7, Paul Blart Mall Cop 2. Odd they never made a third one of those, isn't it? Ex Machina, to its credit, was hanging in the top 10 as well. But the thing with Mad Max Fury Road was it held a good chunk of its audience. The following week, Pitch Perfect 2 lost 55% of its audience. Mad Max Fury Road lost 45%, and the word of mouth was building. Now, it dropped to 3rd place because Tomorrowland came out with a 33 million opening. The Poltergeist reboot, remake, whatever it was, had 22 million and was sat in 4th. So there was a lot of competition coming. But Mad Max would hang around the chart, even as films like San Andreas and Spy and Insidious 3 came along. And it would bubble in the top 5 for a good month, really. It would hang around the top 10 even longer than that. And by the end of the summer in the US, it had made 153 million, which for an R-rated action movie felt, I mean, this was pre-Deadpool really as well. So R-rated films still rated as a massive gamble. And here was one that delivered. Also, the word of mouth had spread overseas. So outside of the US, another 225 million in the bank. Worldwide gross for Mad Max Fury Road, 379 million. And ordinarily in the land of Mad Max, that would be that. There would be a conversation about a follow-up, which there was, but that's it. However, at the Academy Awards the following year, Mad Max Fury Road picked up Oscar nominations for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Cinematography, Best Visual Effects, and also won on top of that for its editing, production design, costume, makeup and hairstyle, sound mixing and sound editing. It won 6 Oscars, and remarkably, the 4th film in a franchise was nominated for Best Picture, and deservedly so. It was coming top of many critics' top 10 lists of the year. It's appeared in Best Films of the Decades list as well. And Miller is now back in that world, because if you go back to earlier in the story when we were talking about, there are 2 films in that. There is the Furiosa film too. In fact, there was one called, it was going to be called Mad Max The Wasteland for a little while, but it's the Furiosa prequel that in the end has moved forward. It was held up by a lawsuit a couple of years after the release of Mad Max Fury Road over bonuses that were said to be owed. But at the point of this being recorded, well, Furiosa and Mad Max Saga is in post-production. The many hours of footage are being edited, and it is scheduled for release in June of 2023. Miller has just made one film in the intervening period. He has put all of his energies back into the world of Mad Max, and if it's anything like Fury Road, then every other film in 2024 has a hell of a job on their hands. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your time. I am just going to do a couple of parish notices before I move on to my next George Miller film. It's a bit of a double bill in this particular episode. If you, first and foremost, if you like this podcast and don't mind supporting it, there are a few ways you can do so. If you want to financially support what we're doing, then if you head to patreon.com/SimonBrew and put some money in the pot there, you get the podcast early, you get it ad-free, you find out the gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes as well. Thank you to everyone who supports the podcast that way. way. It's been invaluable in, let's just say, a very, very taxing year. There's also a crowdfunder running at Just Giving for Film Junior magazine, which I'm doing quite quietly. But if anyone would like to help, just really help this print magazine that I make for young film fans to try and inspire the next generation, if you search for Film Stories at Just Giving, you'll find the details of that there. Costing you absolutely nothing is if you can subscribe to this podcast if you like it. That really helps with algorithms and things like that, and is much appreciated. And ideally as well, if you can leave a hugely positive review. Algorithms seem to like that. More people seem to discover us, and I can't tell you how grateful I am to the many people who have done that for me. I thank you so much. I have a live event coming up. The Last Film Stories live event of 2023 is a bit of a special one, in that I've got Kenneth Branagh live and in person to record a Q&A interview after a just as rare 35mm screening of his Christmas film In the Bleak Midwinter from all the way back in 1995. This promises to be one hell of an event. It has been staged at Picture House Central in London. If you go onto their website, you will find ticket details there. Our profits from this go to support the Centrepoint charity as well. But you will see a film that I so rarely even when it was released, it was really hard to find on the big screen. And then you get Kenneth Branagh in person, in the room, talking to us about it. I'd love to see loads and loads of people there, and it is for a good cause too. I think, though, I've tried your patience with the parish notices in this particular episode. So let's move on to the second of the two films I'm talking about in this particular Film Stories. And I'm back in the world of George Miller. I thought this would be quite an interesting double bill. The film I'm going to talk about, let's just say it had slightly more problems when it was released than Mad Max Fury Road. But I'll set it up, as always, with a clip from the trailer. I'll come to the story of this particular production the other side of this.
This is the farm. Peaceful, calm, civilized. But now, the only chance to save the farm is for one little pig.
He can't leave. You're my lucky pig.
To go to the city.
You can't leave. You can't leave.
Anybody home? Anybody else? Somebody! Let me in! Let me in!
He's entered a world of outcasts and misfits.
Who are these losers?
Well, hey, slow down. If you're not a cat, stay and chat.
I'm hungry.
Fleetly, come back. We don't know where it's been.
Separated from his owner.
I seem to have lost my human.
Totally on his own.
You're just a little pig in the big city. What can you possibly do? What can anyone do?
Destiny has changed his mission. And his courage is about to change everyone's lives.
Whatever the pig says, goes.
And that was a clip from 1998's Babe sequel, Babe: Pig in the City, written by George Miller, Judy Morris and Mark Lamprell, directed by George Miller, starring Magda Szubanski, James Cromwell, Mickey Rooney, and, well, a talking pig. Because as covered before on this podcast, 1995's Babe was a phenomenon, pretty much out of nowhere as well. It was made on a relatively modest budget, around 35 million, in Australia by a first-time director, Chris Noonan. And the tale of the talking pig captured audiences around the world, right the way to a Best Picture Oscar nomination. It remains one of the very best live-action family films of the 1990s, and one of the key people behind the scenes was George Miller, he of Mad Max films, who we've just been discussing. But also, he produced Babe and was instrumental in it going forward. He decided not to direct it in the end, as he would explain to the Los Angeles Times. I didn't direct it for very good reasons. He said, I'm very obsessive as a director. I'd have got too caught up in which way the duck was looking. And as he explained too, Babe was a pre-planned military exercise. every animal movement was trained into the months ahead. Nothing was spontaneous. And he said, if I was on set every day, I would have lost the big picture. As a producer, I got to sit back and take a more Olympian view. Even then, Miller says, I drove everyone crazy. Now, story came out a few years ago that Miller had consulted at one stage Stanley Kubrick on how to bring the story of the sheep pig to the screen, based on the book originally by Dick King-Smith. But it was Chris Noonan who directed the film, and the film became this hit, and it was fairly soon after that it was clear a sequel was going to be required, that Universal Pictures was sitting on a lot of money. It sold a lot on home video as well, and so Babe 2 was moving forward, originally with the working title Babe in Metropolis, but well, it was a slightly different story, because it was unlikely very early on for a start that Chris Noonan was going to come back to direct the new Babe film. As he told AFR, I was kept away from the publicity from that film and I felt very hurt by that. He said, I made a huge contribution to that movie and I wasn't given the kudos I deserved. He does reflect now that people now know that I did direct it, but at the time Noonan campaigned against the way the film was credited, that it was George Miller getting a lot of the credit for the film. He would contact publications that hadn't given him due credit. He contacted the Internet Movie Database, then in its relative infancy, to get credits corrected as well. And as Noonan said of George Miller, he took credit for Babe while I watched. And Noonan wouldn't then direct a feature for many, many years. It was over a decade before he took on Miss Potter with Renée Zellweger. And by that time, a Babe sequel had come to fruition. Miriam Margolyes, incidentally, addressed this in her first book, and she said that Chris co-wrote the film with George Miller, and yet George never really acknowledged Chris Noonan's part in creating Babe. Whenever prizes were won, and Babe received 7 Oscar nominations, it was George who would go and collect the prize, not Chris. And Margolyes reflected in her book, This Much Is True, that I felt that was unfair. For the follow-up then, this was going to be very much more a George Miller film. George Miller was going to direct this time. He was co-writing the script. And also, I mean, creative freedom, he was going to get that in abundance. This was, in the eyes of Universal executives, as close to a sure thing, a sure hit really, as you could get. Because with a sequel to something as family-friendly and lovable as Babe, with George Miller involved, what could possibly go wrong? Okay, well, let's pull up a chair and have a look, because even as the budget for the sequel was set to come in at 3 times the price of the original, Universal was confident that for its 1998 Christmas film it had a massive hit on its hands. There was the fact early on that Christine Kavanagh, who brought her voice to Babe, the late Christine Kavanagh as well, well, she was keen to return to Babe 2 but couldn't agree a deal with Universal for a film that was so cash rich behind the camera. That was odd. But she pulled out of the film. She was replaced by E.G. Daly. And Miller, with some autonomy, was able to work on the screenplay for the movie and was, once again, was going to be able to direct this out of the view of Hollywood. He was going to make this in Sydney, and that meant that Universal executives were a very long flight away from the set for the film. They were, in much the same way Tim Burton got a lot more rope off the back of, for Batman Returns, off the back of making Batman. So Universal gave Miller the latitude to go where he felt the second Babe film should go. Miller duly went there. Production began on the film at the start of 1998, and the production rebuilt the Hoggett farm from the original film, this time in Sydney, and all the filming, well, it was done in and around the area. The Fox Studios complex was relatively new in the Sydney area in Australia at the time, and Babe did a lot of work there, and they went across Australia with all sorts of landmarks and landscapes to knit together the film. There are quite a lot of sights of Sydney that you will see in the film that eventually became known as Babe Pig in the City, and this was a long and difficult shoot because, as had been implied before, when you're bringing talking animals to the screen, you've either got to train the animals or you're going to use the wizardry and the puppetry that was required to get the first film made. It was a combination of both, but the build up to that was extraordinary. A lot of preparation work was needed, and it didn't allow, as Miller had said of the first film, a lot of spontaneity on the set when shooting the movie. The animal stuff had to be pre-planned, and this time the animals were going to be moved away from the confines of Hoggett Farm for large parts of the film, and that would increase the difficulty level of what George Miller and his team were looking to do with the Babe follow-up. There were plenty of practical effects that needed to be realised here, and they were being realised in camera as well. This wasn't a case of it's going into post-production and the animals are being added by computers. I mean, technology wasn't there at that point unless you wanted rampaging dinosaurs. But in the case of Babe Pig in the City, it was very practical techniques that were being used to realise the footage. And, you know, I mean, the actors were a little more used to it. James Cromwell certainly had cut his teeth on the first film working in such environment. But what it meant was this was a long shoot. It went right the way through. I mean, it went over 6 months, I believe, through to the autumn of 1998. But all the while, Miller was allowed to make his film. This was not a case, unlike Mad Max Fury Road, of the studio sending a representative to the set to see what was going on. This was, I mean, Universal was going through troubles at the time. Its big film for that Christmas was going to be Meet Joe Black, starring Brad Pitt and Anthony Hopkins, a remake of the film Death Takes a Holiday, being directed by Martin Brest, that was ultimately going to weigh in at 3 hours and was costing a lot of money itself, but still it was readying a slate of pictures that looked like surefire hits. But at this point, Universal could really use a surefire hit. It was not going through a good run, and so the energies of executives were on productions a bit close to home and with all sorts of firefighting that was going on metaphorically at the studio. The first film, again, I mean, this was the important, this is how Babe 2 got through in the state that it did, whether you like the film or not, was regarded as an absolute bargain, a complete sleeper hit. And there was at no point during the shoot of the film that I could find anywhere that Universal realised the film that it was getting was going off in a very different direction. It's not as if they had a lot of time once filming was complete to sort the movie out either, that the post-production on Babe Pig in the City was swift. But on the flip side, this had been planned to the nth degree before filming began. They knew what the film was when they unpacked the cameras for the first time, and so the edit, whilst frantic, was still relatively swift. And it was a case of Miller being able to put together his director's cut, which would then be screened, and that was the first time that Universal fully set eyes on what it had spent $90 million on. Oh, to have been in that room, because the studio, which had been talking up the possibility of a Babe 3, that's where its plan was, so was it taking for granted what Babe 2 was going to be. Once it realised what it had, the panic stations kicked in. It was a location in California weeks ahead of the release of the film, where a family audience was put in front of the movie with kids reportedly left in tears. If you have not seen Babe Pig in the City, it would be fair to say it puts the animals absolutely through the ringer, leaving several of them in very near-death scenes that George Miller does not pull back on filming, that he still was able to. I mean, I think he just watched Watership Down a lot at this point. In fact, let's go over to James Cromwell, who 2 decades later talked to the Hollywood Reporter about what it was. He just said George finished the picture and he didn't show Universal until it was fully cut, balanced print. And Universal asked George, would he be willing to show the film for management at Universal and their children and their families before? George Miller says yes, because that's the other thing. The family audience that Babe Pig in the City was shown to was made up of the families of the executives and the staff of Universal. They got in the first cut, as Cromwell said, when they go to the hospital, and he says, if you remember the picture, that's a vivisection laboratory. There are animals with posts drilled into their skulls and sores, cancers. It was, oh my God. Cromwell added, then the dog drowning sequence. Well, when I saw that thing, I thought, they can't show this to kids. The kids will freak. And as he recalled, Universal told George Miller, you've got to cut the picture. You've got to cut all of this out. And Miller responded, I can't just cut out what you don't happen to approve of, because I would have to rebalance the whole picture. And Universal said, if you have to rebalance the whole picture just to do that, you've got to do it, because we can't show that. They could not show Babe Pig in the City in the state it was shown at that first preview, and only really preview screening. Universal knew all of a sudden it had a major problem on its hands. The premiere was cancelled, and the trade press started to take notice as well. Babe 2, for much of the year left alone by the press, by the studio as a surefire thing. Well, now the limelight was on it, and Babe 2 was said to be in trouble. Miller went back to the film, and he was tinkering with the movie for just weeks before it was in cinemas. This was in the era of cans of film, not digital distribution, just at the right up to the last possible moment before the prints had to be struck and then the distribution had to begin. Miller was cutting it back, and Universal was having to bat back, but inquiries coming in from journalists about the film. Was this new film really in trouble? And Universal was having to say right up front, this was a darker movie in response to the inquiries coming in. In fact, when Variety ultimately reviewed the picture, the first paragraph of its review was about this to and fro, about the studio having to admit it was a darker picture. There were rumours the rumours took it even further. Was there really a sequence of pigs with wings? Were there technical glitches? Was there a dark and frightening tone? The word of mouth of the movie was before it was even hit cinemas, was in trouble. It was not going the way that Universal wanted. The sequences were being cut down. Mickey Rooney's character was nearly cut out of the film altogether. The aforementioned dog drowning sequence was cut right back. But then I remember going to see this opening weekend. That had a bit of a Bambi effect. It's a lot of the times it's what you don't show. If you make something shorter, it suddenly comes across as a lot more brutal. And what Miller's tinkering had done had not really addressed the tonal problems that Universal had raised. But then he was out of time. This was a film that was finished shooting in autumn and was going in cinemas in November. Now, the cut may have given the film a broader family rating. It originally came in with a surprise PG rating, and it's even just as surprising that it ultimately got a general Universal rating off the back of the cuts that happened. But the clues really were in an interview that George Miller had given to the Los Angeles Times in 1996, 2 years before the film came out. And he said, "I don't see Babe and Mad Max as very different. Well, nor did we when we went to see Babe Pig in the City." Miller said they're both individuals wandering in unknown landscapes, trying to find meaning, overcome a number of obstacles, reach the moment their essence is tested, and through courage effect change in the world they inhabit, with the fundamental difference that Mad Max wasn't herding sheep and trying to get them into a pen. Miller nonetheless said it's essentially the hero story told again. Well, Universal had to stick or twist, really. Ultimately, it could have postponed the film. It could have completely retooled the film, but it was committed to this release. The marketing was well underway. 25th of November, 1998, high season for family movies. It was putting the film in cinemas. It went in front of critics first. And this is where it got interesting again, because you would expect the critics perhaps to tear a film like this to pieces, but the critical response to it, whilst acknowledging that this was a much darker picture, was really quite positive of Babe Pig in the City, none more so than the late Gene Siskel, one of the most influential critics in America at the time, courtesy of the Siskel and Ebert TV show. He would name this as his favourite film of the year, 1998's best film. Siskel would pass several months after. It is the last time he picked a film of the year, and he chose Babe Pig in the City. There was, as much as there was discussion of just how dark it had gone, some reviews picked up that Miller had made an amazing sequel, he'd made a Mad Max sequel. It happened to have a pig in it. I think the response from critics was really quite strong. And in fact, over time, the response from critics has only enhanced. We often sit and write articles and read articles about sequels that take no chances whatsoever, that are happy to repeat the same formula, that are happy to do the same again and again and again and again. George Miller did not get that memo at all. And Babe Pig in the City is a much more difficult film to take kids to. The screening I went to, well, there were people traumatised by it. I mean, there's no two ways about it. This was not the family film they were expecting. It certainly wasn't the family film that Universal had sold. You got a snippet from the trailer right at the start there, and that was a very different movie. But then Universal didn't quite know what it was selling at the point. At the point it was cutting the trailers, it did when it went into cinemas. It seemed almost inevitable that it was going to fall, and fall it duly did. 2 weeks after the release of Meet Joe Black had already fallen short for Universal at the box office, the surefire film of the year, well, it opened in 5th place the weekend of November the 27th to the 29th. Pixar's second movie, A Bug's Life, had 33 million on its second week. The Rugrats movie, the brilliant Rugrats movie actually, the second Rugrats movie is even better. Well, that was in second place with 21 million. Enemy of the State on its second week, 18 million. The Waterboy, 4 weeks in, 13 million. And there was Babe 2, 6.1 million. A flat out disappointment. And at a point where people were spending heavy money on family films. The second week, it got worse. 61% of its business disappeared as the word of mouth just killed any chance of Babe 3, stone dead. The Psycho remake came out the week after and did 10 million. That did more than the Babe sequel. Another Universal film that just hadn't delivered really commercially, although the Psycho remake was slightly cheaper. Then it was Star Trek Insurrection, and Jack Frost, the very freaky Jack Frost, was out the week after. And Universal had been anticipating Babe 2, just as the first film, would clean up over the Christmas period. It just didn't. By Christmas Day, it was out of the top 10, unheard of at the point, unthinkable at the point it was greenlit. But it finished its US run with 18 million off a 90 million budget. This was close to disastrous levels of takings. Even the 50 million it had done outside of America could only bring its worldwide gross up to 69 million. And I mean, Universal doubled down when it came to the home video release, hoping to repeat what it had succeeded with before by just getting so many sales and rentals, but even that didn't really work. I mean, it went for it, but it just couldn't turn the commercial performance of the movie round. And as a result, there were consequences here. For Universal, the head of the studio at the time, Casey Silver, well, he would be out of his job within weeks of the second Babe film coming out. And I mean, that was that. A change of management at the studio, and Babe 2 was one of the contributors to that. Babe 3 was killed off within a week of Babe 2 coming out. There was no way Universal was going to revisit. In fact, it's never revisited it either. In fact, if you go to 2011, such is the joy of Babe 2 within the Universal halls. 2011, the then boss of the studio was still taking shots at the film. He talked about, we make a lot of, what's that word? Bitty something movies. Every one of them breaks my heart. We set out to make good ones. One of the worst movies we ever made was The Wolfman, he not unreasonably said. The Wolfman and Babe 2 are two of the not very goodest movies we put out. And that was in an interview with IndieWire. This was like 13, 14 years after the release of the movie. There's no reason to punch down on it, and yet people were still haunted by it within Universal. That said, as I mentioned, the critical response to it has emboldened, if anything, over the years, and Babe 2 is seen as a really original and daring sequel, just not one necessarily you'd show all the kids who liked Babe 1. And let's face it, Babe 1 went to some dark places. It opens with a truck backing up to take animals away for a not very pleasant fate. For George Miller, once he'd licked his wounds, I mean, he was going to make Mad Max 4, as we discussed earlier in this episode, but he would go back into family filmmaking, and he would be given the chance to make the Dancing Penguin movie on the surface, Happy Feet. But if you've seen that as well, all the clues for where that's going are sat in Babe 2. It's just Warner Brothers did a tremendous job of selling the film. And again, Happy Feet is a much bolder film than it looks, and not quite the one you're expecting. Happy Feet 2 more so. But still, in terms of sequels to family movies, Babe, Pig in the City is held up, like it or lump it, certainly within the halls of people who commission movies, as almost a what not to do. It's a miracle it got through the Hollywood system. There was no chance afterwards of a Babe film ever getting through again. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you so much for your time. If I've not bored you completely, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew, Twitter, X, whatever it is. I'm on Blue Sky too at that exactly the same username. Film Stories is on X, Twitter thingy at Film Stories. We're on Facebook.com/Film Stories Online, YouTube.com/Film Stories. We try and put audio versions of the podcast on the YouTube channel as well for those who want them there. Shop is store.filmstories.co.uk. Lots of magazines, and our Blu-rays of No Way Out and Bull Durham are available there. And if you go to filmstories.co.uk, that's updated every weekday with movie news, reviews, features. We've got games on there. We've got TV stuff on there. We've been seeing a real boost in traffic. We try and make a non-clickbaity film news website, basically, which is a lot harder to do than you'd think because, well, lots of reasons. Thank you for everyone who supports us there. In fact, thank you for everyone who supports Film Stories full stop. We're over 5 years into this project now, bizarrely, and somehow we're still going. And that means I better go off and watch some more films because I'm going to be back soon with another episode of Film Stories. I've got another special coming up shortly. Until then, you all take care. You all look after yourselves. The most important thing is you're all safe and well. I hope you continue to be so. Take care, and I'll be back soon with some more Film Stories. Bye-bye.